You know that feeling when you discover something shocking about someone you thought you knew? That moment when the perfect image you had of them suddenly cracks wide open? Well, get ready, because today we're talking about Johnny Carson, the man who made America laugh every single night for 30 years. He was a king of late-night television, the guy everyone loved and trusted. But behind that charming smile and those perfectly timed jokes, there was a completely different person. A person with secrets so dark that even his closest friends were shocked when the truth finally came out. So buckle up, because what you're about to learn about Johnny Carson might completely change how you remember him. For 3 decades, Johnny Carson sat behind that desk on The Tonight Show, and America absolutely adored him. He was in our living rooms 5 nights a week, making us laugh, introducing us to new talent, and becoming part of our families. When Johnny talked, America listened. When Johnny laughed, we laughed with him. He interviewed presidents and movie stars. He launched the careers of countless comedians. He was more than just a TV host. He was an American institution, a cultural icon who seemed untouchable. But here's the thing about icons. The brighter they shine in public, the darker the shadows they cast in private. And Johnny Carson, his shadows were pitch black. Let's start with something that might surprise you. The man who made millions of people smile every night was actually incredibly cold and distant in real life. People who worked with Johnny for years said he was like 2 completely different people. The moment the cameras turned off, the warm, friendly Johnny disappeared. In his place was someone who barely acknowledged the people around him. Staff members who had worked on his show for decades said he would walk right past them in the hallways without even making eye contact. It was like they didn't exist to him. Ed McMahon, his famous sidekick who sat next to him for all those years, once admitted something really sad. He said that despite working together for 30 years, Johnny never once invited him to his home. Not once. They weren't friends off camera. They were just colleagues who played friends on television. Can you imagine that? Spending 30 years sitting next to someone, laughing together every night, and never being invited over for dinner? It's heartbreaking when you really think about it. But the coldness goes even deeper than that. Johnny had 3 sons from his first marriage. You would think a father would want to be close to his kids, right? Wrong. His sons grew up feeling like they barely knew their own father. He was absent, emotionally unavailable, and seemed more interested in his career than in being a dad. One of his sons later talked about how painful it was growing up as Johnny Carson's kid, knowing that millions of people felt closer to his father than he ever did. Now let's talk about Johnny's marriages, because this is where things get really messy. Johnny Carson was married 4 times. 4 times. And if you think that's just because he had bad luck in love, think again. The truth is much uglier than that. His first wife was a woman named Jody. They got married young and had those 3 sons together. But Johnny was climbing the ladder of success, and as he got more famous, he changed. Jody later said that success transformed him into someone she didn't recognize anymore. The marriage fell apart, and the divorce was brutal. But what's really troubling is how Johnny treated his kids after the split. He became even more distant, barely maintaining a relationship with them. Then came his second marriage to Joanne. This one lasted longer, but it was far from happy. People close to them said Johnny could be cool and dismissive. He had affairs. He drank heavily. The marriage limped along for years before finally ending in another messy divorce. His third marriage was to Joanna, and this is where things get really expensive and really ugly. They were married for over a decade, but it was a toxic relationship filled with arguments and resentment. When they divorced, Joanna walked away with a settlement that was reported to be over $20 million. That was back in the 80s, which would be worth way more today. But here's what's interesting. Joanna later talked about the emotional price she paid for being married to Johnny, and she made it clear that no amount of money could make up for those years. Johnny's 4th wife, Alexis, was much younger than him. He married her later in life, and while this marriage seemed to stick, it raises questions about the pattern of his relationships. He went through women like they were disposable, always moving on to someone new when the current relationship got too difficult or when he got bored. But the really dark stuff? That's about how Johnny treated women in general. There are stories from people who worked on The Tonight Show about how Johnny would sometimes make inappropriate comments to female staff members. This was back in a time when that kind of behavior was often ignored or laughed off, but that doesn't make it okay. Women felt uncomfortable around him. Some felt objectified, but because he was so powerful and so beloved by the public, They stayed quiet. And speaking of staying quiet, let's talk about Johnny's drinking problem. This is something that was kind of an open secret in Hollywood, but the general public didn't really know about it. Johnny drank. A lot. He was known for having a temper when he drank, and that temper could turn nasty. There are accounts of him becoming verbally abusive after he'd had too much to drink. Staff members learned to avoid him when he'd been drinking because you never knew what version of Johnny you were going to get. His alcohol use affected his work too. There were nights when he would show up to tape The Tonight Show and clearly wasn't in the best condition. But he was such a professional, such a skilled performer, that he could usually pull it off anyway. The audience at home had no idea. But the people working with him, they knew. They saw it every night. Here's another dark secret that most people don't know about. Johnny Carson was incredibly controlling about his image and his legacy. He was obsessed with how people saw him. After he retired in 1992, he basically disappeared from public life. He gave almost no interviews. He made very few public appearances. And why? Because he wanted to preserve the perfect image he had created. He didn't want people to see him getting old. He didn't want anyone to pierce the carefully crafted persona he had maintained for 3 decades. But it was more than that. Johnny also controlled what people could say about him. He had powerful lawyers and wasn't afraid to use them. Writers and journalists who wanted to do honest profiles about him often faced legal threats. People who had worked with him were sometimes afraid to tell the truth because they knew Johnny could make their lives very difficult. Even after his death, his estate has maintained tight control over his image and his legacy. And then there's a story about his son Rick. This is genuinely heartbreaking. Rick Carson died in a car accident in 1991, just a year before Johnny retired. Rick had struggled throughout his life, partly because of his difficult relationship with his famous father. When Rick died, Johnny mentioned it briefly on The Tonight Show, but he didn't show much emotion. He made a short statement and then went right back to doing comedy. People who were there said it was shocking how quickly he moved on, at least publicly. What was going on inside his head and his heart? We may never know. But the fact that he couldn't or wouldn't show grief for his own son tells you something about how emotionally shut down he was. Let's talk about money for a minute, because this reveals another side of Johnny that people didn't see. Yes, Johnny was incredibly wealthy. At the height of his career, he was making tens of millions of dollars a year. But despite all that wealth, people who knew him said he could be surprisingly cheap in his personal life. He didn't like spending money on others. He didn't give generously to charity the way you might expect from someone with his resources. His focus was on accumulating and protecting his wealth, not sharing it. There's also the issue of how Johnny treated the people who helped make him successful. Comedians who appeared on The Tonight Show and got their big break, they often credit Johnny with launching their careers. And that's true. But Johnny also had a reputation for being ruthless with comedy material. If he heard a joke he liked, he might use it himself without giving credit. Young comedians who were trying to make it were afraid to tell their best material around him because they worried he might steal it. And speaking of his show, let's talk about the workplace culture at The Tonight Show. Behind the scenes, it was often tense and stressful. Johnny had very high standards, which isn't necessarily bad, but he also created an atmosphere where people were afraid to make mistakes. Staff members talked about walking on eggshells around him. You never quite knew what mood he would be in or how he would react to things. This kind of unpredictability made for a very uncomfortable work environment. Here's something else that's troubling. Johnny Carson had the power to make or break careers, and he knew it. If you got on Johnny's bad side, it could seriously damage your career in entertainment. There are stories of people who offended Johnny in some way and then found themselves blacklisted from The Tonight Show. And back then, if you couldn't appear on The Tonight Show, you were missing out on the biggest platform in entertainment. Johnny wielded that power, and sometimes he used it vindictively. One of the saddest parts of Johnny's story is how lonely he was. Despite being surrounded by people, despite being adored by millions, he never seemed to find real connection or real happiness. His relationships were shallow. His friendships were superficial. He built walls around himself that nobody could get through. And in the end, when he retired and stepped out of the spotlight, he lived alone with his memories and his regrets. People who saw Johnny in his final years before his death in 2005 said he seemed like a ghost of his former self. The spark was gone. The charm had faded. He was just an old man who had pushed everyone away and now had nobody left. He died at age 79, And while the world mourned the loss of a television legend, the truth is that very few people actually knew the real Johnny Carson or could honestly say they had been close to him. So why are we talking about all this now? Why dig up these dark secrets about someone who's been gone for years? Because it's important to remember that the people we see on television aren't always who they really are. Johnny Carson created one of the most successful personas in entertainment history, but behind that persona was a deeply flawed human being. He was cold. He was controlling, he was emotionally unavailable, and he hurt the people closest to him. This doesn't mean we can't appreciate his talent or acknowledge his contributions to television. Johnny Carson was undeniably brilliant at what he did. He changed late-night television forever. He made people laugh during difficult times. He gave us joy and entertainment for 3 decades. Those things are real and they matter. But we also need to acknowledge the whole truth. The charming guy we saw on TV came at a cost. His family paid that cost. His wives paid that cost. The people who worked for him paid that cost. And ultimately, Johnny himself paid that cost, dying alone and isolated, having never learned how to let people truly in. The story of Johnny Carson is a cautionary tale about fame and success, and what happens when you prioritize your public image over real human connection. It's a reminder that the brightest stars often cast the darkest shadows. And it's a lesson about how we sometimes ignore troubling signs about our heroes because we want so badly to believe in the image they created. For too long, we ignored these dark secrets about Johnny Carson. We looked the other way because we loved the show so much. We didn't want to know the truth because the truth was uncomfortable and complicated. But now we know. Now we see the full picture. And that picture shows us that Johnny Carson was both a comedic genius and a deeply troubled man who never found the happiness he gave to others. The next time you see a clip of Johnny Carson on The Tonight Show making everyone laugh with that perfect timing and that winning smile, remember that there was so much more going on beneath the surface. Remember that the people we admire on screen are complex human beings with flaws and failures just like the rest of us. And remember that success and fame don't automatically equal happiness or fulfillment. So what do you think? Does knowing all this change how you see Johnny Carson? Does it make you appreciate his talent more? Or does it make it harder to watch those old clips? These are complicated questions without easy answers, but they're worth thinking about. If this video opened your eyes to something you didn't know before, do me a favor and hit that like button. Share this video with someone who remembers watching The Tonight Show or someone who's interested in the real stories behind Hollywood legends. And definitely subscribe to this channel because we're not afraid to dig deep and tell you the truth about the people and stories that shaped our culture, even when that truth is uncomfortable. We've got plenty more eye-opening content coming your way, and you won't want to miss it. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.